Mr. Jones will never laugh again. Mr. Jones will never hug his mother again. Mr. Jones will never hide Easter eggs for his nieces and nephews at a family gathering again. Never again. Because this defendant murdered Mr. Jones on the night of June 15th, 2021. I'm going to go piece by piece to show you why everything this defendant is claiming is unreasonable to believe. Once you see and add up all the circumstances of that night, you will clearly see that this defendant murdered Mr. Jones on that night, June 15th, 2021. So what is this defendant claiming? This defendant is now claiming he acted in self-defense on that night that he shot Mr. Jones. And at the end of this presentation, you will clearly see how unreasonable his claim of self-defense is. So let's get to it. What is Merle's first unreasonable claim? Merle is claiming that he heard Mr. Jones carry a knife. We know Merle never saw Mr. Jones with a knife. We know Merle never said anything about seeing a knife the night he shot Mr. Jones. So what else does Merle need you to believe for this claim to be reasonable? He needs you to believe his story about why he believed Mr. Jones had a knife. And here's that story. He says that Finley Williams warned him after he was warned by Nikki Felton, don't drink with Mr. Jones, he will cut you. The same person, Finley Williams, before warning Merle, then saw Mr. Jones and Nikki Felton laughing at the Red Apple Tavern. What's reasonable to believe from all these occurrences? It's that Nikki Felton and Mr. Jones are playing a bar prank on Finley Williams. Finley Williams sees this. He understands, oh, it's a joke. Man, they got me. You know who else is at the bar? Merle. He's my friend. I'll play the same joke on him. That's reasonable to believe. What's unreasonable to believe from all the circumstances of being warned, don't drink with Jones, he will cut you with a knife. It's unreasonable to believe that Mr. Jones always has a knife on him, and he will cut people around him if he drinks. I mean, this guy, I don't know why they let him in the bar if he's just going to be cutting people if he drinks. What else do we know? That Mr. Jones did not have a knife on his person the night that he was shot. We know Merle said that he thought Mr. Jones had a knife on him. We also know that just because someone says something doesn't make it true. Let's move on to the second claim. Merle's second unreasonable claim is that Merle shot Mr. Jones in self-defense. Merle ran from the scene of the crime once he saw the patrons of the Red Apple Tavern noticed him. They ran down the street and grabbed him and kept him from getting away. Only because of the Red Apple Tavern patrons was it not harder to find the person who shot Mr. Jones. I think that Merle thought he committed the perfect crime and then freaked out once he saw that someone saw him and Mr. Jones. What else do we know? that Merle threw away the gun after he shot Mr. Jones and is now claiming that he carries a gun because he's in a bad neighborhood and he's worried for his safety. If you just had to use a weapon for your safety in a bad neighborhood, why would you discard your only means of protection? What else do we know? That night that he shot Mr. Jones, Merle refused to tell police why he shot Jones. And then, 2 weeks later, after the shooting, Finley Williams, Merle's trusty friend, comes forward to police with a perfect story for Merle and his defense. That 2 weeks in between the shooting and when Finley Williams came to the police with the perfect story, that's plenty of time to come up with something. Let's move on to the third claim. The third claim is that Jones came after Merle outside of the bar. That is crucial for Merle's self-defense claim. And that's what he is claiming, is that Jones was so close to him that he thought he was about to get knifed, and that's why he shot him. There's a lot of claims that you have to believe in order to believe this third claim, so bear with me. First claim is that Jones lunged at him, that he was close enough that Merle was worried that Jones could get to him. What do we know? A reliable eyewitness put Mr. Jones and Merle 10 feet apart right after he heard the shooting. If you're 10 feet apart, it's unreasonable to believe you're about to be knifed. It's too far away to worry about a knife that you can pull out of your pocket. He would have to have a 10-foot sword to be reasonably worried about getting stabbed at 10 feet. What's another claim that Merle needs you to believe for this third claim to work? Mr. Jones followed Merle home, is what Merle needs you to believe. But a reliable eyewitness said Merle left 5 minutes before Mr. Jones. If Merle was walking at a leisurely average walking pace, 18, 20 minutes a mile, in 5 minutes, he should have been a quarter mile away from the Red Apple Tavern. But we know from the evidence and from the pictures that we saw in this trial that they were just across the street from the Red Apple Tavern. What do I think happened? I think Merle laid in wait for Mr. Jones to come out of the bar that night, and he got lucky that Mr. Jones left shortly after he did. What's another claim that Merle needs you to believe in order for this third claim to work? Is that Mr. Jones was so close to Merle that Jones could knife him. Merle said that he did not have his gun drawn until Jones lunged at him. If somebody's lunging at you and you've got your gun down here, it's very hard to pull the gun, get the drop on him, and execute a perfect cross-torso shot, killing him instantly. Very hard. What do you think? What do I think happened? I think that Merle either had the gun out and was brandishing it at Jones before he shot him, or he shot him at a distance. Everything I just discussed we know to be crystal clear. There is no evidence Mr. Jones lunged at Merle. There is no evidence that Mr. Jones followed Merle home that night, like he is again claiming. There isn't even any evidence that Merle didn't bring the gun to the bar that night just to kill Mr. Jones. To tell you all my theory of the case plainly, and from what I know the evidence shows and from what I believe, I think Merle was tired of Mr. Jones accosting and bothering him, because Mr. Jones knew Merle stole his money. That is not enough of a reason for Mr. Jones to die. Merle wanted to cancel his debt. He was tired of the consequences of his actions, constantly reminding him of what he did at the Red Apple Tavern when he stole Mr. Jones's money to pay for a drink. Merle was ready to kill Mr. Jones that night, and that is what he did. I hope you, the jury, clearly see, after weighing all the circumstances of that night against all the defendant's unreasonable claims, that this defendant's claim for self-defense is unreasonable, and because of that, a guilty verdict in the first degree is the appropriate charge for this senseless crime.